There is a thing known to every honest breeder of flowers and to almost no one else, that a plant comes true, in the end, to the seed that made it, and to no other. You may drive any stake you please into the ground and letter any name upon it you like, and have the whole show believe it. None of it will teach a stranger's hand to have raised the line. For a new flower is only the last of 1,000 that were sown and thrown away to reach it, and the throwing away is where the breeder lives. A cunning man may steal a bloom and carry it off and set it on a table under his own name, until no eye in the tent can tell it from his own work. But no man alive can steal the 10 years of culling that stand behind it. The seedlings raised and judged and grubbed out by the barrow load, the single true one kept from among 100 near misses. Because those are not the flower, they are the patience and the eye that made it. And an eye cannot be forged after the fact. And the old benchmen of the trade say a harder thing still, that a well-dressed lie about who raised a thing will pass with every soul who wishes to believe it, or fears to doubt it, which is to say with nearly everyone alive, save only the one plain person who happens to know what the true cross was, because she is the one who made it. A seed keeps its own account and cannot be argued with. Sow it honest, and the ground pays you true. Sow a borrowed thing, and it comes up in the end exactly what it is, and not what the label swears. For a false rose runs untrue at last, whatever name is driven in beside it, and there is no lie so fashionable that a second summer will not find it out. And so the whole art of undoing a clever lie about the making of a living thing is not genius at all. It is only patience, and a true eye, and the drawings and the dated books kept where no frost and no fire has reached them, and one seedling carried away alive that nobody thought to count, and one unregarded woman that nobody troubles to watch. Keeping the garden of a house that has long since forgotten she keeps anything at all. Ruth Weldon had been at Alderleigh Court some years, and in all that time had contrived, with a good deal of care, to be very nearly invisible. She was 29 when the story finds her, a slight, plain, quiet woman with a still, level way of looking at things, brown hair bound back simply under a plain cap, and the composed, unhurried hands of a person raised to handle the delicate and the growing without ever presuming to own one. She was the only daughter of the Reverend Samuel Weldon, who had held the poor living of Netherfold on the edge of the fen country for 30 years, and who had been, besides a gentle and exact and unlucky clergyman, the finest breeder of flowers in 3 counties, and died no richer for it. He had christened and buried and married his handful of poor parishioners for a stipend that never once caught up with his family's wants. And he had spent every shilling he could beg from the household and every hour he could steal from his duty upon a passion that the world thought an eccentricity, and that was in truth a kind of genius. The raising of new flowers from seed. He kept his frames and his beds behind the crumbling rectory, and there, year upon patient year, he crossed and sowed and watched and culled, chasing a thing most men never trouble to imagine. Not a flower found, but a flower made, coaxed into the world across a dozen generations of seedlings that had never existed before his hand joined this pollen to that seed, and Ruth had grown up at his elbow among the pots. Before she was 12, she had his eye, could tell a true seedling from a near one at a glance, could read in the set of a first leaf what a plant would come to, and she had his hands, patient and sure, that could graft and bud and coax a sulking cutting into root when the gardeners at the great houses gave it up for dead. And she had the whole quiet undertrade of the plantsman, how to keep a crossing book so that every seed sown could be traced to the 2 parents that made it, how a line is fixed across the years until it comes true from its own seed, how a raised variety differs from a chance sport and an honest breeding from a lucky theft. Above all, she had his creed, which he had given her at the potting bench with his plain brass hand lens in his fingers, holding it out over a seedling so the small, true magnified world of it sprang up clear. Look, Ruth. Look close. The glass does not care what the label says, nor what you paid, nor what you wish. It shows you the plant exactly as it is. Breed for the bloom that is true under the glass, and never for the bloom that only pleases across the room. The pleasing one flatters and fails you, and the true one keeps faith though not a soul is looking. A plant comes true to the seed that made it and to no other, and you cannot argue a seedling into being what it is not, nor hurry a true cross, nor fake a line you did not raise, and a false thing, sow it how you will, runs untrue in the end. The frames died with him. He was found one raw March morning, slumped gently among his seed pans in the cold light of the potting shed, gone between one breath and the next, with a papered packet still in his hand, and it killed, along with him, the only home Ruth had ever had. There was nothing to inherit but debts, a shelf of dried specimens and drawings nobody would buy, the plain brass hand lens, which she kept and keeps still, and a barrel full of pots she could not carry away. The living remnant of his life's work, a rose line he had brought within one generation of the true crimson he had chased for 20 years, and not lived to fix. She saved what few plants she could, potted and begged a carrier to keep them, and went out, as portionless gentlewomen do, to be a companion. And through the offices of a clergyman's widow who had known her father's worth, she was taken at Alderleigh Court, as companion and reader to the Dowager Duchess of Alderleigh, a great, cold, exacting old personage of unquestioned county consequence. Then some way into a long decline, who wanted her letters read and her stiff evenings filled, and found, to her surprise, that the plain reader had a further use, for the dowager had one softness in her whole proud nature, and it was her flower garden, a famous garden in its day, her own creation as a young bride, gone sadly to ruin now with age and neglect, and the want of any hand that understood it. And it was discovered, almost by accident, that the quiet companion with the parson's brass lens could do with the sulking, overgrown, half-dead beds what no gardener the estate hired from the town could do. She brought the old roses back from the dead. She knew the names of things nobody else could name. She could take a slip in autumn and show it to you rooted and thriving in spring. So Ruth Weldon stayed on as the unregarded real keeper of the dowager's garden, which was no office known to the peerage and carried no dignity whatever, and went about the neglected beds with her father's lens in her apron and his knife in her basket, mending and raising and coaxing. And the household, when it thought of her at all, thought of her as it thought of the garden tools, a useful, silent, unregarded thing that was noticed only on the rare day it was wanted and not to hand. And in her own hours, the early mornings before the house woke, the long light evenings that were her own, Ruth Weldon did the thing she had never told a living soul at Alderleigh that she did. She bred roses. She had carried her father's living remnant with her, those few precious pots, and set them in a forgotten corner of the old kitchen garden behind a screen of espaliered pear where no one ever came. And there, patiently, across the seasons, she took up the work he had died with unfinished. She crossed his near crimson with the hardiest and truest of his old stock. She sowed the hips and pricked out the seedlings by the score and grew them on, and judged them without mercy, keeping the 1 in 100 that carried the thing forward and grubbing out the rest, exactly as he had taught her, and she wrote it all down as he had taught her too, in a plain, dated crossing book, every cross and every sowing, and every culling set down in her small clear hand, with his own private marks in the margins. A little drawn sun beside a seedling that had come true, a small firm cross drawn through the ones she had judged and thrown away. It was the whole diary of her heart. Since she kept no other, her father's death was in that book, and her long loneliness, and a stubborn private hope, all of it turned into the slow making of a flower, because the garden was the one country in which a portionless companion was rich. And in the fourth spring, in a corner of the frame, one seedling opened that stopped her breath, a rose of a deep, clear, velvet crimson she had seen only once before, in her father's eye when he described the thing he meant to make and did not live to see, full and true, and holding its form, and coming true from its own seed. She had fixed it. She had finished his life's work. She told no one. She half believed that a companion who bred roses in secret was a slightly absurd thing, a woman reaching after a greatness that was no business of hers, people taught by the world that they are worth nothing learned to say it first themselves, to get the sting out of it. And so the loveliest rose in England grew unseen behind a pear hedge, kept by a woman the house looked straight through, and known to one living person who was she. There was one person at Alderleigh who guessed a little of it, and loved her for it, and she was the one bright thing in Ruth's grown life, the Duke's younger sister, Lady Sophia. Lady Sophia was everything Ruth was not, warm, quick, laughing, adored, and she had a real, untutored love of flowers, and had found Ruth out one June morning kneeling among the seedling roses in the forbidden corner with earth to her wrists, and had not been got rid of after. Ruth Weldon, she had said, turning a bloom in her fingers with shining eyes, I have never seen that rose in any garden in my life, and I have seen a great many. Where did it come from? And Ruth, caught, had said it was nothing, an old thing of her father's, and Lady Sophia, who for all her lightness was nobody's fool, had looked from the rose to Ruth's face and said, You made that. Do not you dare tell me you did not, for I can see it in you. It was the nearest to being seen that Ruth Weldon had ever come. But Lady Sophia married that autumn, a good, plain, loving man with an estate away in the north, and went away from Alderleigh, as bright sisters do, and she carried in her heart, unregarded among 100 happy new things, the knowledge that the quiet companion made roses no one else could make, and never once thought to say so aloud to the drawing-room, because why would she? Nobody asked, and so the one witness who could have spoken for Ruth was 300 miles away and thinking of other things, and Ruth turned her pages alone and said nothing, and was, on the whole, not unhappy, because the rose was coming true, and the work was good, and the mornings were her own. The master of the house she scarcely knew, and feared a little, as the whole household did. Adrian, Duke of Alderleigh, was 38, and had been in his youth, by every account, a warmer and an easier man than the one who now ruled the court with a cold, exact, unresting reserve. What had frozen him was not grief, but betrayal. As a very young man, newly come to his title and his vast responsibilities, and knowing nothing, he had trusted the running of half his affairs to a charming, plausible, universally recommended man of business, a man everyone vouched for, a man of the most agreeable address, a man who wore honesty like a well-cut coat, and that man had robbed him coolly and cleverly for 3 years, dressing the theft in friendship and fine feeling the whole while, and had very nearly brought the great estate down before an old steward caught it, and the worst of it, the thing that had done the lasting damage, was not the money, but the discovery of how completely and how long he had been fooled, how the warmth had all been counterfeit, and he too green and too flattered to see it. He had never been fooled again. because he had made very sure of it at a price. He had grown watchful and dry and shut. He prized loyalty above every other virtue, and despised above every other vice the climber, the flatterer, the smooth-reaching soul who works upward by charm and by lies, and he had walled his heart so high that the county thought him proud and cold, and were not altogether wrong. His one warm and unguarded feeling in the world was for his mother. He knew the old dowager to be proud and difficult and often unkind, and he loved her without the least illusion and with his whole hidden heart, and it grieved him past speech to watch her fail, and when he cast about for some gift that might give her joy in her last years, he had lit on the one thing she had ever truly loved, her ruined flower garden, and had resolved to have it made glorious again, more glorious than it had ever been, and laid at her feet while she could still delight in it. It was the one hopeful, tender, softening project of his shut life, and to accomplish it he sent, of course, for the most celebrated man in England. Mr. Ambrose Frayne was that not uncommon figure of the age, a genius of trade, who had made himself a gentleman by sheer force of taste and application. He had begun, it was whispered and he never denied it, in a market garden, and he had risen, by a real eye for a flower, and a far greater eye for a fashion, and a manner that charmed duchesses, and a tongue that could sell a common thing as a wonder, to be the arbiter and supplier of every great garden in the kingdom, the man whose new varieties set the mode, whose word made or unmade a nurseryman, who walked among the great as an equal because the great could not do without him. He was a large, handsome, warm-mannered man of about 45, with an easy laugh and an air of bluff open honesty that was the most finished thing about him, and he came down to Alderleigh with an army of men and a great scheme, and set about the ruined gardens, and it was there, going one evening where he had no business to go, behind the espaliered pear in the forgotten corner, that he came upon Ruth Weldon's roses. She was not by. He stood a long time before the crimson, very still, in a way that a gardener's boy who saw him never forgot, and he knew in one breath exactly what he was looking at, because a man who has spent 40 years pricing flowers can price the priceless in a heartbeat. It was worth a fortune. It was worth more than a fortune. It was worth the one thing his risen soul still hungered for, and money could not buy, which was to be not merely the seller of great flowers, but the maker of the greatest of all, to have his name live in a rose after the fashion had forgotten his shop. He made inquiry, carefully. He learned that the corner was the private ground of the dowager's gray companion, a nobody, a portionless woman who tuned the old lady's evenings and grubbed in the beds. And Mr. Ambrose Frayne, who had climbed too far to be squeamish, began, very gently, to smile. He tried first to buy it, in his warm, open way, as one plantsman to another, and Ruth Weldon disliked him from the first word and did not trust him the length of the walk. He praised her roses generously. He offered, most handsomely, to bring the poor neglected things out properly, to grow them on at his own famous nursery and put them before the world, with of course full and grateful acknowledgment of the raiser, and Ruth, who heard the shape of the thing under the warmth as clearly as she heard a false note in a plant, thanked him quietly, and gave him nothing, and let him go on believing her a fool. He came again, less warmly, and named a sum that would have kept her in modest comfort for the rest of her life, for the whole of the stock and the papers and the raiser's rights, and she refused it, gently, and he went away that time not smiling, for a man like Frayne does not forgive being refused a thing he has already, in the counting-house of his mind, spent and sold. But there was nothing to be done by force. The roses were hers on her own ground, and she guarded them close, and so Mr. Frayne, who was a patient man and a thief only where thieving was safe, said no more, and finished the dowager's garden with real and celebrated skill, and won the whole delighted gratitude of the house, and bided his time. And in the autumn, when the beds were dug and the frames were being turned and the companion's guard was down amid the general labor, a single potted seedling went missing from the end of Ruth's row, one of the near ones, a strong plant of the middle sort, and, some little while after, her crossing book, which she kept in a drawer of the potting shed, was found by her one morning not quite as she had left it, the ribbon tied wrong, and she stood very still, and understood that she had been read, and told herself she must be imagining it, because the alternative was too large and too frightening for a companion to say out loud. What Mr. Frayne carried away was not, of course, her true rose. It was the culled intermediate, a seedling 3 years back in the line, the one she had noted in her book and grubbed out for a fault, a splitting, quartering habit in the center of the bloom, and a weak neck that let the flower nod and hang. Faults that showed only in the second season, and that she had judged and recorded and thrown away on the road to the true crimson. But it was crimson enough, and full enough, and glorious enough in its first flush to deceive every eye in England but hers, and it was, above all, unfixed. It would breed a muddle, and it would come untrue in time. But Mr. Frayne did not mean to breed from it. He meant to show it, and be crowned, and by the time it faltered his fame would be made and past unmaking. He had, besides his stolen reading of her book, enough to know the line's story if he were ever pressed, and enough, he thought, to counter her if she ever dared to speak. And so he brought it out. He did the thing grandly, under the full weight of the family's authority, exactly as a clever thief brings out a stolen thing, fast and public, and wrapped in a sentiment no one would dare to question. He grew the seedling on in secret at his nursery, and the next midsummer, at the great county show that the whole fashionable world attended, Mr. Ambrose Frayne unveiled, to gasps and to tears and to a burst of applause that made his name forever, a new rose of extraordinary loveliness, a deep velvet crimson such as no one had seen, which he had raised across long and patient years, and which he begged leave to name, in honor of a great lady whose garden he had lately had the honor to restore, and whose failing health was known and mourned, the Duchess of Alderleigh. It was a triumph beyond even Frayne's hopes. There is nothing the world loves like a beautiful thing wrapped in a tender story. And here were both, crowned with a duke's patronage and a dying lady's name, and the rose itself was undeniably lovely in that first summer, which no puffery can manufacture, and carried the whole thing on its own true beauty into every great garden in the kingdom. The show's high committee gave him its gold medal. Fashionable ladies begged for grafts and paid absurdly, and set the rose in places of honor. It was drawn, and praised, and sung over, and Mr. Frayne, its supposed raiser, found himself lifted from the first of nurserymen to something like an artist, a man of genius, the age's great creator of beauty. And the Duke of Alderleigh, watching his cold, proud, failing mother's worn face light with a joy he had not seen on it in 20 years as she held the crimson rose that bore her name, and understood that her ruined garden had given the kingdom its loveliest flower, felt the one clean happiness his shut heart had known in longer than he could remember, and was grateful to the rose, and grateful, above all and most dangerously, to the good, bluff, devoted Mr. Frayne, who had wrought this gift for a dying woman, and asked, it seemed, nothing for himself but the joy of serving a great house. The Duke's gratitude to Frayne became, that summer, one of the fixed facts of Alderleigh, as solid as the walls. It is worth marking because everything that followed had to break itself against it. Ruth Weldon stood in the crowd at the show in her gray gown and watched a man she knew to be a thief receive a gold medal for her father's rose under a false name, and said nothing and thought she would be quietly sick. And then she went home to Alderleigh and said nothing there either, for longer than you would think a person could bear. A life of being worth nothing teaches you to expect nothing, and to distrust your own claims first of all, and the thing was so enormous and she so small that to speak seemed not brave but mad. And there was the Dowager. That was the thing that held her tongue past the point she could afterward forgive in herself. The old lady's joy in the rose that bore her name was the one warmth of her failing life. She spoke of it daily. She had it brought to her room, she believed, with her whole proud heart, that her garden had crowned her age with glory, and it had given her something to set against the dark. And Ruth could not see how to claim her own, without tearing that from a dying woman, without standing up to say that the great lady's rose was a stolen thing, and the great lady herself the innocent front of a fraud. So she was silent, and told herself the rose was doing good where it was, giving joy, and that nothing so small as whose hand had truly raised it could matter beside an old woman's comfort at the end. And she almost made it hold. What broke it was Frane's greed, which was larger than his caution. The triumph went to his head, as triumphs do, and the world clamored for more, and it was understood. It was announced that the great raiser was even now perfecting a companion to his masterpiece, a second Alderleigh rose finer than the first, to be unveiled at the grand exhibition the Duke was to give the following summer, a public crowning of the restored gardens to which the whole kingdom of flowers would come. But Mr. Frane had no second rose, because he had never raised the first. He had a stolen middle seedling that would breed him nothing but rubbish, and he knew it. And so he came back to Alderleigh that autumn, all warmth and welcome as the honored restorer of the gardens, and began to go about the old kitchen garden and the frames with a covetous, searching eye. And Ruth learned from old Jonah, the under-gardener who had been her father's friend and was her one ally in that place, what she had most dreaded. Jonah came to her white in the face. Mr. Frane, he said, had been asking him, careless, like over a pipe, whether the gray companion had ever had any better rose than them she showed, any particular one she kept back, private, the best of her lot, and had let fall that he'd heard tell of a right good dark one, the true one, at the end of the north frame, and meant to have a proper look at it before he went. And Ruth Weldon went cold in the potting shed, hearing it, for she knew exactly what the true one was. It was the crimson. It was her father's rose, the fixed and finished true rose, the crown of the whole line, that grew alone and unshone at the end of the north frame under a light she tended herself, of which there existed one single plant in all the world and no copy anywhere, and which she had shown to no living soul. Frane had caught the scent of it, and meant to steal it too, and grow it on in secret, and bring it out as his perfected second masterpiece, to take the last and best thing, her father's true rose, made out of the deepest patience of two lives, and drive his own name into the ground beside it, and sell it to the world. He meant to take the true one, and something in Ruth Weldon that a lifetime of worth nothing had never quite killed stood up at last and said, "No, not that one." She went about it, even then, as gently as it could be gone about, because she was Samuel Weldon's daughter, and did not know how to be otherwise, and because she still wished above all to shield the Dowager. She did not go to the county. She did not make a clamor. She went privately, hat in hand, to the two people she thought had a right to hear it first, to Mr. Frane himself, and then, when that failed, as it was always going to fail, to the Duke. To Frayne she said only, quietly, standing among the very frames he had robbed, that she believed he knew as well as she did whose the roses truly were, that she would ask nothing about the rose already shown, would raise no clamor, would let the dowager keep her joy and her name upon the flower exactly as it stood, if only he would let the true one alone and take no more. It was, she thought, a fair and merciful offer. It cost him only a greed he had no right to. Mr. Frayne heard her out with his easy smile never leaving his face, and she understood before he answered that she had made a bad mistake, had shown a dangerous man exactly where she was dangerous, and exactly how little she meant to fight, which to a man like Frayne is not mercy, but weakness. And weakness is an opportunity. "My dear Miss Weldon," he said, warm as ever, "you have overtired yourself in these beds, and you have brooded alone until you have got a very strange fancy into your head. It is a thing one sees in solitary women who have lived too long in the shadow of the great. Let me give you some friendly advice. Say this to nobody. To nobody at all, for if you do, I promise you it will not be believed, and it will not be forgiven, and you will find the world has a very short way with an obscure dependent who tries to climb into notice by pulling down her betters." And he touched his hat to her, pleasantly, and went that same week and did the thing she should have known he would do. Went to the Duke first, and salted the ground before she could stand on it. For Frayne understood the Duke's nature the way Ruth understood a plant, knew its every part, and exactly where to press. He did not bluster. He went to the Duke grave and reluctant, a bluff, honest man forced to a painful duty, and said it distressed him beyond anything to bring his grace such a thing. But he could not in conscience hold it back, that the dowager's companion, that quiet Miss Weldon his grace had likely never noticed, had grown strange and unsettled solitary women did. He had seen it, and had begun to make a wild and painful claim that she was going about to say the great rose was her own, stolen from her, and meant, he feared, to make a public scandal of it. That it was, of course, a sad delusion, the sort that fastens on lonely dependents who come to fancy their master's glories their own, but that it had its dangerous side. For if such a tale got abroad, it might cast a shadow, however unjust, upon her ladyship's honored name and poison the one joy of her last days, and that his grace should be warned, and the poor woman gently but firmly checked before her fancy did the dying Duchess a public cruelty. It was beautifully done. It was, once again, the exact truth turned precisely inside out, which is always the strongest lie, and it armed the Duke against the one thing Ruth could bring, for it told him in advance that she would come with just this story, and taught him to hear the true account, when it came, as the raving of a disordered and grasping mind. And it wrapped the whole in the two things the Duke could not think past: his love for his mother, and his lifelong horror of the climber who works upward by lies. To disbelieve Frayne was now, in the Duke's armored heart, to expose his dying mother to a scandal at the word of a scheming inferior. Frayne had made the truth itself an attack on the old lady's peace, and made Ruth, in advance, the very kind of plausible reaching deceiver the Duke had sworn his whole life never to be fooled by again. There is no crueler trap to set for such a man, and no surer. So that when Ruth Weldon, some days later, gathered the whole of her small courage and stood in the Duke's library, a long cold room, where the ordered evidence of a great guarded life pressed in from every wall, and told him, plainly and quietly, that the celebrated rose was her own raising, bred across years in the old frames by her own hand and her father's before her, and that she had proof of it, and wished only to be believed and to keep the last and best of the line from the same theft. She was speaking into ground salted against her a week before and never had a chance. She saw a terrible hope leap up in his face and be crushed. For one instant, hearing her steady, particular, wholly unhysterical account, some part of the Duke had wondered, and then Frane's warning took, and the wondering closed over into a cold and pitying anger. The anger of a man told in advance that this grasping fantasy was coming, who now watches it arrive exactly on schedule and dares to bring its lies into his house against a dying woman and a man he trusts. He did not rage. The anger of such men is quiet, and worse. He said he had been warned to expect precisely this, and had hoped he had been misinformed. He said he had made every allowance for her solitary situation and her long service and the strange turns a lonely mind may take, and would make one more, and not turn her out of doors that night. He said she would never, so long as she drew breath, repeat this thing to any living soul, that if one shadow fell across his mother's name from this squalid invention, he would know its source, and she would learn what the anger of his house could do to a friendless woman. And then he said the thing she carried longest, because he said it not in fury but in a weary contempt, looking at her as at something that had disappointed him past expectation. I had taken you, at least, for an honest woman. I see I mistook you, as I have learned to expect to be mistaken in people who reach above themselves. It is the oldest trick there is, to try to climb into a great name over the body of the one who made it. Get out of my sight, and be grateful I do not trouble to ruin you. And Ruth Weldon, with her crossing book still folded and untouched in her hand, for you cannot make a man who has been warned examine your proof. The very offering of it is only more of the madness he was promised, curtsied, and went out, and did not weep until she was 3 floors up in the dark of her own room, and then only a little, being long out of the habit of expecting better. The Dowager finished it the next morning, and it was the Dowager who made it absolute. Frane had gone to her too, gently, and the old lady had swallowed the tale whole, because he told it well, and because to believe it cost her nothing, and to doubt it would have cost her the one joy of her age, and to her the companion's claim was not merely false, but a personal outrage. A low creature she had fed and sheltered reaching up out of the servant's passage to snatch the crown from her failing head. She had Ruth brought before her, and did what the grief-sick and gentler Duke had not quite done, cast her off, formally, coldly, and entirely. Miss Weldon was dismissed the Dowager's service, and would be gone from Alderleigh by the week's end. She would be given no character, no letter of any kind, for how, said the Dowager, her old voice like a closing door, could she in conscience recommend to any decent household a woman capable of this ingratitude? And she might think herself fortunate to be let go quietly and not exposed. Ruth heard it out with her hands folded and her face still, because she had learned very young that when the great have decided to be unjust, the only dignity left to the small is not to writhe. And she said, at the end, only, "Very well, your grace. I am sorry to have grieved you. That was never my wish, and I would not do it now for the world. I will be gone as you say." And she went out to the garden in the last of the light, to the beds she had brought back from the dead, and stood a while among her father's roses, and then went up to pack her box. And the great house of Alderleigh was rid of the one person in it who had ever raised a flower worth the name, and did not know it, and would not have believed it if it had been cried from the roof. There remains the hardest hour, the one that decides everything, and it came that same night. For Ruth Weldon's real trial was not the losing of her place, which she had half expected all her life. It was the thing she had to choose, alone, in a cold room, with a hard frost coming down. She could not carry a garden away in a companion's box. But she could carry a little, and she went out by dark, with old Jonah keeping watch and saying nothing, and lifted with her own hands the few plants that were the whole living heart of the line, 2 of her father's parent stocks, 3 of the graduated seedlings that told the story of the crossing, and, wrapped last and most carefully, the single true crimson from the end of the north frame, her father's finished rose, lifted with all its earth into a pot she could just lift. And she carried them, and her crossing book, to the poor lodging she had taken over a saddler's shop in the market town of Chalcote, 8 miles off, where a carrier set her down with her box and her basket of roses in the black cold of 2 in the morning. And there, that first night, the thing was put to her plainly. There was a hard black frost settling, the killing kind, the kind that would take the tender lifted roots by morning as surely as fire, and she had in that bare room fuel enough for one small warmth through the night, and one only. Enough to keep her own blood moving in the cold, or enough to bank a little brazier close about the lifted plants and carry them living to the dawn. But not both. And she sat on the floor a long time between the 2, and it was not, as you might think, an easy choice, for she was cold to the bone and frightened and utterly alone, and the roses had already cost her everything she had. And there was a voice in her, small and reasonable and very tired, that said, "Let him go. Burn the book with the last of the coal, and warm yourself, and let the frost take the roots, and be free. No one will ever know. You cannot win. A great man's word will crush your dated scribbles like a moth, and if the true rose dies here in the dark, then the theft dies with it, and the dowager keeps her joy, and you keep your peace. And who is harmed? Let the whole ruinous business die tonight, and be warm." And Ruth Weldon took her father's plain brass hand lens out of her pocket, and held it, and did not burn the book. She banked the little fire close about the roses, every coal of it, and wrapped the pot in her own shawl and then in her cloak, and sat the rest of that black night against the wall with her arms about her knees, shivering, keeping the true rose alive with the warmth she denied herself, because you build on the bloom that is true and not the bloom that pleases, and the pleasing thing that night was to be warm. And the true thing was 3 roots of a dead man's patience that no soul in the world but she believed in. In the gray of the morning, the frost lay white on the inside of the glass and thick on the sill, and the roses lived, and so did she, and that, and not anything that came after, was the moment Ruth Weldon won, though it would be a year before a single other person knew there had been a battle at all. She took up in Chalcote her father's honest trade, or as much of it as a poor woman might. There was a nurseryman near the town, a plain, blunt, close-mouthed old man of great and quiet repute named Amos Redfern, once a famous razor himself in his London days, driven to the country by his chest, a friend by his plain coat and plainer speech, honest as the daylight and proud of nothing but his trade. And he took Ruth on, first to make botanical drawings for his catalogue, for her hand was exquisite, and then, finding what she knew, to sort and keep his seed and advise him on his crossings, paying her a pittance and treating her, which was rarer, as one who knew her business. She lived very poor and very quiet, and grew her few rescued roses on in a corner of Redfern's ground where they throve, and she said nothing to anyone of where they came from, and nothing of the great rose that was that very summer being praised in every fashionable garden in the kingdom under a great lady's name and a thief's raising. She heard it praised. She could not help but hear it. The whole country talked of the Duchess of Alderleigh, and of the genius Mr. Frayne, and of the grand exhibition to come. And Ruth Weldon drew her plants and sorted her seed and kept her own counsel and her father's book, and endured, which is a quiet thing and looks like nothing and is the hardest labor there is. And then the rose began to tell the truth, because a rose cannot help it, whatever name is on the stake. In its second summer, the summer of the grand exhibition, the Duchess of Alderleigh came untrue. All across the kingdom, in the great gardens that had paid so dearly for their grafts, the celebrated crimson opened split and quartered and confused in the center, and hung its heavy heads on necks too weak to bear them, and lost the pure clean form that had made it a wonder. Did, in short, exactly and precisely the fault that Ruth Weldon had recorded in her book 3 years before as her reason for grubbing an intermediate seedling out of the line. It was not ill fortune, and it was not bad culture, though Frayne swore desperately that it was both. It was blood. It was an unfixed seedling reverting to the muddle it had never been bred past, coming untrue as a stolen thing comes untrue, in its own good time, before all the world. And Mr. Ambrose Frayne, who had promised the kingdom a perfected second rose finer than the first for the great exhibition now almost upon him, found himself unable to mend the first, unable to breed a second from a plant that would give him nothing but rubbish, and facing for the first time in his risen life the near prospect of a public and ruinous failure at the very summit of his fame. It was old Redfern who first said the thing aloud, because he had the eye and no reason on earth to flatter anyone. He had got a plant of the famous rose, as every nurseryman had, and he stood before it in its faltering second summer one morning, turning a poor split bloom in his blunt fingers with a face like thunder, and he said, to no one, in his plain way, this was never a fixed variety. Thee cannot tell me a true bred rose runs back to a mess like this in a season. This is a chance seedling shown for what it is not, and half the flower gardens in England gulled. And Ruth Weldon, sorting seed at the bench behind him, went very still, and after a while, quietly, because she had carried it alone as long as she could, and here at last was a man who might understand, she said, Mr. Redfern, I can show you what it is. And she brought out her book, and she laid before that honest old man the 3 dated states of the rose in her own hand, and, when he asked, the living plants themselves grown in his own corner, the parent stock, the smooth early seedling struck through in the book with a note, the very intermediate that had come untrue. And then, last, the true crimson from the end of the north frame, the fixed and finished rose that came true from its own seed and that no one in the world had ever seen. And Amos Redfern, who had spent 50 years raising flowers and could not be deceived in one by any power under heaven, went through it slowly and grew pale and sat down, and at the end he took off his spectacles and looked at the gray, quiet woman at his bench as though he had never truly seen her, and said, every note of it is thine. The great Mr. Frayne never raised a rose in his life. He stole a dead man's work and a live woman's, and showed the world the runt and kept back. No, never had. The true one. I have been in this trade 50 years, and I never saw the like. And then, being an honest man and a practical one, he told her the 2 hard things she needed to hear. The first was a warning, and it was the same warning old craftsmen have always given, the same in its bones that a clever man had used against her as a threat, that her word would carry nothing. Thee must understand, Redfern said heavily, that if thee stands up and says it, thy word against his, thee will be crushed. He is Mr. Frayne, and thee is a dismissed companion he has already named a madwoman. A plain woman's truth against a famous man's smile is no contest at all, and they will hear thee as exactly the grasping fraud he has told them to hear. Thee must not say it. Thee must show it. Thee must put the thing itself into their hands, where a stranger can test it and be forced to believe it whether he likes thee or no. The dated book, the living line, the fault in his rose, and above all the one rose he cannot match, the true one, blooming, that only the razor could have. And thee must do it before the Duke himself, and before people who know a flower, at a time and place where the roses can answer for thee, since thy voice never will. And the second thing Amos Redfern did, that very week, without being asked, was to take Ruth's book and go with her before a plain attorney in Chalcote and there, on his own long professional oath as a master of the trade, swear and sign and lodge a dated certificate that he had examined the plants and the papers of Ruth Weldon, and did solemnly attest them to be the true and only record of the raising of the rose the world called the Duchess of Alderleigh, together with a finer rose unshown, so that whatever befell, whatever fire or frost or great man's anger came, the truth should be set down and dated and safe beyond any man's power to burn. Now, said old Redfern, tying the book up again in its ribbon, it is not only in thy hand and thy roses, it is in the law's cold keeping too. Let him try his word against that. And meanwhile, at Alderleigh, the trap the Duke had set for himself was closing on the truth from the other side, driven by the one part of his nature that Frayne had never reckoned with, his exactness. The Duke did not know a rose from a rhododendron, but he could not endure a thing that did not add up, and the failing of the great rose did not add up. He had watched his mother's joy curdle into distress as the flower that bore her name went to ruin in her own restored garden and all the kingdoms. He had watched the celebrated Mr. Frayne grow evasive and overwarm and full of excuses, promising a second rose that never came nearer, and something cold and watchful in the Duke, the very faculty his long ago betrayal had honed to a razor, had begun, quietly, to attend. And two things came to trouble him further. The first was his mother herself, who, fretting over her failing rose and her weakness, had begun to speak of the only hands that had ever truly understood her garden, and to ask, querulously and often, why the quiet Weldon woman had been sent away, the one who could coax anything to grow, and whether she might not be got back to save the rose, and to seem to have forgotten, in her decline, that it was she who had cast her out. The second was Lady Sophia, come down from the north to see her mother, who heard the whole story of the dismissed companion and the disputed rose, and turned white, and then turned on her brother with all the warmth of a woman who has seen a plain truth the clever have missed. "Adrian," she said, "you great blind proud fool, the roses were always Ruth Weldon's. I saw them myself, years ago, in the corner behind the pears. Before ever Frayne set foot here, I held the crimson in my own hand, and she owned to me she had raised it, and I have never forgotten it, because I never saw its equal. You have sent away the only person in England who can save our mother's rose, and called her a thief for making the thing your fine Mr. Frayne is dead for stealing." And the Duke of Alderleigh sat very still under that, and said nothing, and did not sleep, for he was a proud man and a hard one. But he was not at the bottom a stupid one nor a willfully unjust one, and a cold suspicion he could not put down had begun to grow in him that he had been fooled again, worse than before, and by the same arts, and had crushed the honest one, and crowned the thief with his own hands. And so, because he could not bear an account that would not balance, and because his mother wept for her rose, and because his sister had looked at him with contempt, he did the thing that undid Frayne. He sent, privately, quietly, telling Frayne nothing, to the market town of Chalcote for the dismissed companion who was said to have the true hand with roses, meaning only, still, to save his mother's flower, and not yet dreaming, not remotely dreaming, that he was sending for the woman who had made it. Ruth Weldon read the Duke's cold civil note, a summons, near enough, to attend at Alderleigh and give her opinion on the ailing rose, with no word of apology and none of accusation, only the flat assumption that she would come when a duke called, and she sat with it a long while, and then she went to old Redfern, and they talked late, and she resolved to go. Not to plead, for she had learned what her pleading was worth. Not to accuse, for her accusing would be called madness. She would go, and take her book and take her roses, the whole line living in their pots, the culled intermediate and the parent stock and the graduated seedlings, and last and wrapped like the treasure it was, the true crimson in full bud. And she would answer the Duke's question about his mother's rose with the plain truth of what it was, and let the roses, and not her worthless word, carry it before whatever company was gathered, and she prayed it would be gathered. For a thing shown to one proud man in private can be denied, but a thing shown to a room of people who know a flower cannot. And as it happened, God or chance was kind, for the day the Duke had named fell but 3 days before the grand exhibition itself, and when Ruth Weldon came up the long drive to Alderleigh in Redfern's cart with her basket of roses, she came into a house and gardens already filling with the whole flowering world, the committee of the great show, the fashionable and the knowing, the drawing of plants and the setting of tents, and, moving among it all as its presiding genius, warm and bluff and indispensable, and not yet knowing that the one person on earth who could unmake him had just been handed down at his own triumphant gate, Mr. Ambrose Frayne. They received her at first as a tradeswoman come about a sick plant, and it was in the great glass house, before more people than the Duke had meant, and fewer than Ruth had hoped, that the thing at last came to its head. The Duke there, cold and watchful, the Dowager brought out in her wheeled chair, frail and sharp and clutching after her failing rose, Lady Sophia at her mother's side with her eyes on her brother, old Jonah, the under-gardener, fetched up trembling with hope, some half-dozen of the show's committee, men who knew roses, and Frayne, who had come in easy and smiling to see off whatever drab gardener had been called to fuss over the flower, and who stopped, 1/2 second, when he saw who it was, and then came on smiling, because a man does not climb as high as Frayne had climbed by losing his countenance in public. The Duke bade Ruth, civilly and coldly, to look at the rose and say what ailed it, and Ruth Weldon did not then say what he expected, which was some gardener's talk of soil and pruning. She said, quietly, into the whole listening glass-house, Your Grace, there is nothing wrong with its keeping. What ails it is what it is. It is a good seedling, but an unfixed one, 3 parts of the way to a true rose and no further, and it was bred to run back to just this muddle in its 2nd season, which is why it was thrown away. If Your Grace will allow me, I will not tell you that. I will show it you, and you may believe your own eyes and these gentlemen's, and not my word, which I know is worth nothing here. And she asked for a table, and they gave her one, and she laid out upon it, in the clear north light of the glass-house, the whole of her case in the order her father had taught her, never asking a man to take her word where she could put the thing itself into his hand. She set down first her father's brass lens, and with it she showed them the fault in the famous rose close to, the splitting quartered center, the weak neck, and named it. Then she laid beside the sick bloom her own 3 dated states of that very rose, in her own hand the smooth early seedling struck through, the intermediate, with its recorded fault written out and dated 3 years gone. and she showed how the celebrated rose matched the thrown-away intermediate leaf for leaf and split for split, the flaw and all, so that whoever had shown it to the world had shown a seedling she had judged and discarded, and could not have got it saved from her own cold row. Then she opened her crossing book to the daylight and let the committee men turn its dated pages. The whole line laid out year upon year, every cross and every sewing and every culling set down as it happened and could not be set down after. The visible labor of a thing being made, and beside the book she ranged the living plants themselves, the parent stock and the graduated seedlings carried up living in her basket, so that any man there could walk the line with his own eyes from the old stock to the famous flawed crimson, and see it stood in the middle of her work and nowhere near the end. And the committee men bent over it and murmured, and one of them, a knowing old grower, looked up at Frayne with a very strange expression beginning on his face. And then, last, while the glass house held its breath, Ruth Weldon lifted from her basket the pot she had wrapped like a sleeping thing, and set it on the table, and drew off the cloth, and there stood the true rose, her father's finished crimson, the fixed and perfect thing at the end of the line, in full new bloom. A rose such as not one soul in that glass house had ever seen, deeper and truer and cleaner than the famous flower had been even in its first false glory, holding its form like a struck note, the real crown the celebrated set had always lacked. And there was a silence, because there was nothing to say against it. It was so plainly the true end of the very line the book and the plants had just walked them up, so plainly the same maker's hand carried one step further than the thief had ever been able to follow, that the case was complete before she had said a single word more. And Mr. Ambrose Frayne, cornered at last in the one place where his word could not save him, did the thing that cornered clever men do, which is to strike first and hardest, and stake everything on brazening it through. He laughed, warmly, and spread his hands, and appealed to the room over the head of the gray woman, as a man of sense appealing about a poor lunatic. He said it was the saddest thing in the world, that he had warned his grace a year ago this very delusion would come to just this, that the woman was a gardener's drab of some small cunning, who had spent years about his lordship's frames, and had memorized his Frayne's roses, and had now got up a parcel of scribbled papers and grown on some cuttings filched from the estate, and cooked the whole into a fraud, working on his grace's known love for the Duchess to steal a great man's life work, that her so-called book was a forgery she had scrawled at her leisure this 12-month past in her lodging, and that as for her precious secret rose, this true one she made such a mystery of. And here his contempt ran ahead of his cunning. Here the climber's need to be cleverest in the room reached one fatal half-inch past what a safe man would have said. As for that, why, I know all about her famous last rose. It is nothing but the runt she had staked at the far end of the north frame and never once let flower. A poor backward thing she has been nursing along and now trots out full-blown and swears is a masterpiece. I dare say she has. And he stopped. He stopped because he heard it. He heard it the same half-second the whole glass-house heard it, and his warm face froze on the words. For no living soul had ever seen the true rose at the end of the north frame. It had never flowered where any eye but Ruth's could reach it. It was not in her book by any description a stranger could read. It had been shown to no one, spoken of to no one, and the one person on earth who could have known that a plant stood staked and unflowered at the far end of that particular frame could have known its exact private place, and that it had never been let bloom, and had crept there to learn it, was the man who had gone hunting through her frames in the dark to steal it, and been just too late, and taken the runt of the middle row instead. He had, in his one greedy half-second of needing to seem to know everything, described the precise secret state of the one plant in the world he had sworn under this very roof he had never seen, never known, never touched. The words hung in the glasshouse air. The knowing old grower on the committee said, slowly into the silence, "And how, Mr. Frayne, would you come to know just where in her frame the woman kept a rose she says she never showed to a living soul?" And Mr. Ambrose Frayne, for the first time in 45 climbing years, had no answer, and the ruin of him came up into his face for the whole room to watch, and his easy assurance went all to pieces at once. The way a stolen rose comes untrue, all in a moment, and past mending, and before everyone. The rest was quick, as such things are once the note is struck true. The Dowager Duchess turned her old head slowly in her chair and looked at the celebrated Mr. Frayne as at a light gone on in a room she had thought she knew, and then she looked at the gray companion she had cast out, and at the true crimson rose on the table, and something worked in her proud, stricken face that had not been there in 20 years. The committee men drew back from Frayne as from a thing that soiled, and the Duke of Alderleigh, who had stood through the whole of it with his long-shut face opening by degrees like a frost breaking up, looked from the ruined man he had trusted to the quiet woman he had crushed, and understood, wholly and at once, the size of what he had done. He did not bluster, and he did not delay. He crossed the whole length of the glasshouse to where Ruth Weldon stood by her roses, and before his mother and his sister and the committee of the great show and old Jonah at the door and the gathered servants, the Duke of Alderleigh made the dismissed companion a low, exact, deliberate bow, the bow a man makes to an equal, or to his better, and said, in a voice that carried, "Miss Weldon, I have done you a great and public wrong upon a liar's word, because I was too proud to look at your proof when you offered it, and too much a fool to know an honest woman when she stood before me and told me the truth. I ask your pardon. I do not expect it. You shall have from this house every reparation it is in my power to make, and the first of them is that every soul here shall know whose hand raised the rose my mother's garden gave the world." And Ruth Weldon, who had not wept when they cast her out, stood very still and level by her father's rose, and was, at the last, after so long, seen. Mr. Frayne was finished that hour. The gold medal was recalled in disgrace before the exhibition ever opened. The committee, shown Redfern's sworn certificate and the dated book and the living line, ruled the truth without a dissenting voice, and the great Mr. Frayne, whose whole edifice of fame had stood upon being the man who raised the loveliest rose in England, was unmade the moment the world learned he had raised nothing at all, but had robbed a dead parson and his portionless daughter, and lived long enough to be a byword, and went abroad, and is not worth the rest of the telling. The rose itself was set right in the eyes of the world, registered anew under its true raising, and it was Ruth Weldon's own asking. When the amends were being made, and the Duke would have had the finest rose in the kingdom carry her name, that it should not. She asked instead that the true crimson be entered under her father's name and his parish, a name no fashionable soul had ever heard, the Reverend Samuel Weldon of Netherfold, who had chased it 20 years and died among his seed pans a poor man believing he had failed. And she asked, with a gentleness that shamed the room, that the flawed and famous first rose be allowed to keep the dowager's name still, and be quietly bred true at last under her own hand, so that it should no longer betray the old lady who had loved it. For the fault was Frayne's and never hers, and there was no reason a dying woman should lose her one joy because a thief had built it on a lie. And the old Dowager Duchess, hearing the gray creature she had turned out without a character ask, as her first act of power, that her enemy's comfort be preserved, did the hardest thing her whole proud life had ever cost her. She sent for Ruth Weldon alone, and owned her wrong plainly, and did not make it easy for herself by weeping over it, and asked, not as a duchess, but as one old unjust woman to a young wronged one, to be forgiven. And Ruth forgave her, and meant it, and the two of them were friends, in a plain, grave way, for the year of life the old lady had left, and Ruth kept her garden for her to the end. The Duke was slower, because the deepest waters are. He had a great wrong to undo, and a proud cold habit of years to unlearn, and he set about both, with the exactness he brought to everything, which is a truer sign of a man's heart than any easy warmth. And Ruth Weldon, restored now to no false grandeur, but to her plain, honored place as the keeper of the true garden and the raiser of the great rose, watched the shut, watchful, betrayed man she had feared come slowly and wholly undone in the only way that lasts, which is by degrees and against his own long guard. He came to the garden, at first on the business of the roses, and then on no business at all. He learned the names of things from her. He found, to his own great surprise, that the one place his unresting mind came quiet was among the beds where the gray woman worked, who wanted nothing from him, who had never once in her life reached upward for anything but the truth, and who had taught him, without meaning to and at a price he would spend the rest of his life being grateful for, the thing his betrayal had taught him only by halves, that the false note and the true note are equally easy to swear to, and only the ear or the eye that has nothing to gain can tell them apart, and that the plausible, warm, charming ones are not the safe ones, and the safe one is the quiet one at the bottom of the garden who will not sound a false thing to save her own life. He had spent 20 years learning to distrust everyone for fear of the charming, and a plain woman with earth on her hands taught him, at the last, the far harder and better lesson, which is how to tell true from false, and so to trust again where trust is earned. He asked her to marry him in the garden, among the roses, one gold evening a year and more after the glass house, and Ruth Weldon, who had long ago put all such hopes away as things not meant for the likes of her, looked at him a long moment, and then said yes, plainly as she said everything. They were married in the autumn, quietly, from the court, in the small parish church, with old Amos Redfern fetched up in the Duke's own carriage to see his seed sorter made a duchess, grumbling all the way that the world had gone soft in the head and pleased as ever he had been in his life. And Lady Sophia laughed and wept together, and old Jonah stood at the back in his best coat with his hat crushed in his hands, and the county offered a duke married to a dismissed companion out of a saddler's lodging, and no scandal it could prove, said everything that might be looked for behind its fans, a scheming creature, a designing nobody who had wormed her way in by playing on his grace's guilt, and then had to sit and watch, across the years, the one spectacle gossip has no answer to, which is two quiet people, visibly, durably, unfashionably happy. The new Duchess of Alderleigh never played the great lady, and never once tried. She kept her father's plain brass hand lens on the potting bench to the end of her days, and looked through it before she trusted a single seedling, so that the gardens should build on the bloom that was true, and not the bloom that pleased. And she took the ruined kitchen garden corner, and the old frames and made of Alderleigh, in time, the first raising garden in the kingdom, where new roses were bred honestly and registered honestly and given away as often as sold. Her father's true crimson she never bettered, though she bred on for 30 years. It was always said by those who knew roses that the rose he had chased for 20 years and she had fixed in 4, and carried living through a killing frost on the strength of her own denied warmth, was the truest red ever raised in England, and it took, at last, the name that a nobody clergyman had earned and never lived to wear. And she took to the county's scandal and then to its pride any young person of the parish or the tenantry with a wish to learn the garden, and taught them for nothing, saying her father had raised flowers for the love of it and gone hungry and never turned one away, and she saw no reason a duchess should be less honest than a poor parson, nor beauty be kept only for the great who could pay. They had, together, better than 30 years, and the man the county had thought frozen for life grew warm so gradually and so wholly that the young who came after could never be got to credit the old repute of him. To the end of his days, when any person was pressed upon him on the strength of a fine manner or a fashionable name or a plausible warm tongue, he would say only that he had learned his own way of valuing people twice over, both times at a high price, once from a charming man of business who had robbed him with a smile and taught him to trust no one, and once, better, from a parson's daughter with earth on her hands who had taught him the far harder thing, which is how to know the true from the false and so to trust rightly again. For you must never take a thing's word for its own worth, since the false bloom and the true bloom are equally easy to swear to across a crowded room, and only the eye that has nothing to gain and looks close and honest through the glass can tell them apart, and only a second summer surely will. His duchess outlived him by some years, and looked through the plain brass lens before she trusted a seedling until her hand could hold it no more. And when she followed him, the county, which had once had every opinion of the great cold duke and none whatever of the grey companion he married, came in from 30 miles about, tenants and tradesmen and the taught-for-nothing grown grey now with families of their own, and stood along the road from the court to the church in an autumn wind, for the parson's daughter. It was not for her rank. The county had rank to spare. It was that in 35 years no soul in that country, gentle or simple, had ever once had from Ruth, Duchess of Alderleigh, a false thing sworn to be true, and it made hers the truest bloom in the county. There is a thing known to every honest breeder of flowers, that a plant comes true, in the end, to the seed that made it, and to no other, and at Alderleigh they tell the story still of the year the great rose came untrue, and the plain woman who gave the garden back its own true blood. A charming, celebrated, universally trusted gentleman took a nobody's roses and showed them to the world as his own genius, and wept his modest tears over them, and was believed against all comers, as charming gentlemen are, and every art he used, the beautiful lie, the borrowed tenderness for a dying lady, the true story turned neatly inside out. The great family's love and fear enlisted to crush the truth-teller was defeated in the end, not by a magistrate and not by a cleverer schemer, but by a quiet keeper of a garden who knew that a rose cannot be argued into a hand that did not raise it, and who, holding at the bottom of a basket the one living proof that could cost her everything, would not let it die to be safe, because she had been taught by a poor honest man that you build on the bloom that is true and not the bloom that pleases. She was not saved by beauty, for she had little to spare, nor by fortune, for she had none, nor by anyone's belief in her word, for no one in that house believed it. She was saved by the plainest thing in the world, which is that a true seed comes true in the end whether or not a single soul is watching, and a false one comes untrue whatever name is driven in beside it, and whenever, long after, a fine name was believed against a plain one, or an honest woman's work was called a schemer's forgery, or a clever man forgot that somebody, somewhere, quietly keeps the true line. Someone in that county would tell of the gray companion who would not warm herself at the cost of a dead man's roses, and who let the flowers answer when her own voice was worth nothing, and it made hers the truest bloom in the county. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from, and what this story made you feel. And if it moved you, consider subscribing softly so you won't miss the next one.